Look at everything that the modern day individual would use. Commodities that even a day without having would be unthinkable. Complex things like the internet and medication, and simpler but needed things such as heat, electricity, and plumbing. It eventually makes one wonder, where did all of it begin? Go back to the late 17 and 1800s. There's the answer, the Industrial Revolution, a time where everything, from machines and business to people and places, were all changing dramatically, but not entirely for the positive. The price for such changes was high in the form of many lives being difficult, troubled, and even ended for an outcome that they wouldn't be able to witness. This now raises the question, how did the Industrial Revolution pioneer advancement and reform in the 19th century? Although these advancements increased the quality of life overall, those who felt the effects were limited to mainly business owners and industry leaders, while the working and middle class, made up of those who worked in the factories, the fields, and the mines, which included children as young as 5, had to endure the tragedy of terrible working and living conditions, all for little to no reward. One of the main advancements during the Industrial Revolution involved a multitude of new inventions, leading to increased and easier mass production. One of the most influential, if not the most influential, of these inventions was electricity itself, in the form of the electrification of the US. It started out in the 1870s with the use of batteries, and moved on to generators, which allowed for the more widespread use of electricity. One of the primary applications of electricity was their use in everything, including the new incandescent light bulb, introduced by Thomas Edison, which were used for their heat, brightness, and cleanliness. This was especially the case when compared to their gas-powered counterparts, the only alternative at the time. The steam engine was another notable invention because of how they can be used as a more large-scale, isolated power source for factory machines and means of transportation, like the newly developed locomotives and steamboats, which went on to revolutionize trade and travel by making journeys across the nation quicker and easier. Many more inventions were to show up at this time, like the spinning jenny in 1764, making profound progress in textile making, the cotton gin in 1793, and McCormick reaper in 1831, which improved agriculture. The Erie Canal in 1825, which linked the waters of Lake Erie to the Hudson River, allowing for transport of people and cargo. The Bessemer process, which led to the creation of steel mills, had greatly improved the quality of the steel industry. Morse code and telegraph lines had their own effect in communication in 1836. Edward Jenner's vaccinations in 1796 led to the eventual immunization of smallpox and many more diseases later on. The Elias Howe sewing machine in 1846, which improved the clothing and shoe industry. Interchangeable parts, another major invention, had eased repair and increased the lifespan of machines and equipment. Between 1860 and 1890, over 400,000 patents were issued, over 400,000 new machines and ideas being mass-produced as they acted as a driving force which led the country further as it continued to grow and develop. The same cannot be said for the working class of people, those who had to operate these machines. Most of them had emigrated either from old farms or foreign lands to find opportunity in U.S. cities during this time, opportunities to find new jobs and become rich and successful. This led to a process of urbanization, a process of increasing amounts of urban areas. It had many positive aspects such as improved medical resources, education, transportation, and access to many economic opportunities, but it had many more glaring negative outcomes, such as the amount of alcohol and political abuse, labor abuse in the factories, and poor city planning, which went on to worsen sanitary conditions in the tenements. Poorly constructed apartments built with density of residents as the primary focus. As many as 2 or 3 families could fit into one of these cramped apartments. Just these conditions were enough to reduce life expectancy by a considerable amount. Life at work was even worse. The work itself was different depending on where one worked, whether it be in a factory, a farm, or a mine. All of them shared the same difficulties, such as tedious, repetitive, and unsatisfactory work, long hours, an average of 12 hours a day, some jobs forcing even more, and little pay, as low as 10 cents an hour, an $8 to $10 workday. The work was as dangerous as it was tedious. Many factories had little to no windows, no heating systems, and even no lights. The machines were loud, and no safety equipment was given. As expected, many people were injured and even killed on the job site. On top of everything, because of the influx of new migrants, there was a constant threat of being fired because a worker was too slow or didn't fill the high expectations of the managers. The work wasn't limited to adults either. Children had to work as well in order to help provide for the family. They were subject to the same treatment as adult workers, but for even lower pay. These tragedies had raged on during the 1800s and eventually sparked the creation of labor unions, organizations of workers from each trade with the goal of negotiating for better working conditions. The most widespread way involved workers going out and participating in protests and strikes, leaving the factories with no workforce. But this was still ineffective because there is no shortage of people willing to take any vacancies. This conflict would eventually continue into the 19th century until the government had to intervene. During the 1900s, reform was a massive and obvious need for the laborers and management alike. With this in mind, several federal laws were passed, but the two most important were the Fair Labor Standard Act and the Taft-Hartley Act. In 1938, the federal government had passed a law called the Fair Labor Standard Act, a law which establishes minimum wage, overtime pay, what circumstances require overtime pay, and most importantly, establishes child labor standards. In 1947, over 50 years after the Industrial Revolution had ended, labor disputes had still occurred at high rates. A new law was then passed, the Taft-Hartley Act, which helped increase the flow of commerce in response to widespread anti-labor and union sentiment after World War II. It establishes and describes the rights of both employers and employees and their relationship with each other. All of this occurs in what came to be known as the Progressive Era, a period between 1890 and 1920 in which influential thinkers and activists worked together to improve the problems facing U.S. society like women's suffrage, child labor, education, and urbanization through several legislative and social reforms. This came through federal laws being passed and even more new developments being made. Eventually, through the work done in the Progressive Era, modern social and political regulations and rights now exist today. And it all started with the Industrial Revolution, a time of drastic change in many areas of life, many for both positive and negative impacts. The Industrial Revolution had allowed for the main triumph, which can be described as the advancement through the many new innovations that had been introduced, but not without the tragedy of stepping on the laborers who worked to make the leaders' dreams a reality. For this, and poor planning to accommodate for how many people were willing to work led to terrible poverty, widespread public disease, and the eventual death of those who couldn't afford to pay for a higher quality of life. As a result, in the aftermath of the industrialization, many thinkers and activists worked to find and eventually found solutions for the terrible conditions left behind after the period. While we today live with the triumph of the results of their labor, the price for the advancement and development of U.S. society through the Industrial Revolution will always be an unfortunate tragedy for us to remember.